The name of Deputy Clare Daly.
Corla, Minister, this is essentially the same issue as Deputy O'Farrell has just raised, and I know that you acknowledge that there's a problem with pay in the Defence Forces, but your kind of defence is sort of that you didn't know about it or you're maybe looking at it. Well, look, the reality here is that the facts speak for themselves. The level of pay to the Defence Forces does not meet a threshold of decency in large numbers of cases and has to be supplemented by the social welfare system. That's a fact. Now, you are correct that the situation has been aggravated by the austerity cutbacks on public sector workers over the last number of years, but the roots of it are in the fact that traditionally the Defence Forces have been paid less than their peers in other forms, and that has to be grappled.
Look, I take some of those points, and I don't want to repeat what I just said to the previous question. We do. By the way, there are two departments involved here. There's mine and the Department of Public Expenditure, because we are trying to maintain a defence force of 9,500. We're currently taking on a significant number of new recruits to make sure that we maintain that number. And obviously there are budgetary consequences to that. So I am happy and will insist on the reviews that have been committed to taking place, and we will look at the outcome of those reviews when they're ready, and hopefully we'll be able to act on them. But there are lots of families and people within the public sector, and in particular in the private sector, that have had to get supports from the state in terms of income levels in recent years for all sorts of individual and in some cases very complex reasons. And so I don't think we should draw broad sweeping conclusions from this particular issue. But there are issues within the Defence Forces around pay and remuneration that will be the focus of a review in the not too distant future, and let's wait and see what the outcome of that review is.
Deputy Daly.
It's not a case of broad sweeping conclusions, Minister. The criteria operated by the Department of Social Protection means that if your income falls below a certain level, then social welfare steps in to bring you up to a level of decency. And you only have to look at the pay rates inside the Defence Forces to know why that's particularly necessary there. Irish Defence Force personnel have always been poorly paid. I was brought up in a Defence Forces family. I know these long-standing problems, but it has been aggravated by the cuts, 20% loss of earnings since 2009, and that has consequences. So unless the review is prepared to look at the basic pay rates that are being given to Defence Forces personnel, well then that problem will remain, and you don't seem to be wanting to budge that one. On the issue of people sleeping in cars, it is linked to the barracks closures, but it's more than that. It's also linked to the undermining of the residential accommodation that you have said you've referred people onto, because we know of people in the Curragh who are not affected by barracks closures, who are travelling from other areas, who couldn't access residential accommodation on the Curragh because of the way that accommodation has deteriorated, and indeed the number of families who've been forced out of that accommodation because of Defence Forces policy. So these things do have consequences. Our attitude is you have a duty of care to Army personnel, and these issues are pressing and they have to be addressed.
Minister.
Well, first of all, I do have a duty of care to Defence Force personnel, and I take that seriously. And can I say, just in relation to basic pay, the only pay agreement that this government is responsible for is the Haddington Road pay agreement. And there was no cut to the basic pay of any enlisted personnel under the Haddington Road agreement within Defence Forces. So let's just be clear on that, right? And I'm not going to go into previous pay deals and previous decisions that the previous governments were forced into, but I'm just saying our record is that. Our record is also a recognition of the fact that there is a review needed for some of the elements of pay and remuneration within the Defence Forces, and we're proceeding with that. So I take your point. On the basis of a review, I will then have a credible set of recommendations to act upon. And when we get those recommendations, we can obviously bring them before the House here, we can discuss them, and hopefully the government will be in a position to act on them.
Thank you.
involve just basic pay, and while basic pay may not have been cut under Haddington Road, it is nonetheless a fact that the payments made and average earnings to soldiers have deteriorated by 20% since 2009. Fact, because of the cuts in allowances, which make an essential and important part of their pay packet. So these issues have to be addressed. And I do think, I've noted you've said you're not in favour of giving them negotiating rights. However, you are aware that PD4 are taking a case to the European Court of Human Rights, and as a result of maybe the judgment in the case of the Gardaí being allowed to access the machinery of the industrial relations machinery of the state, privileges awarded to other citizens, I think that should be extended to the army as well, and you might be better off agreeing it with them rather than being forced to do it by Europe in a year or two's time, and it might be in everybody's interest if that were to take place.
Minister.
The only reason I referred to basic pay was because you referred to basic pay previously. I do accept that there are other elements, obviously, that affect people's income. So I'm not pretending that this isn't an issue. All right, so let's just be clear on that. And there are other elements to Haddington Road that has affected the effective take-home pay of people in the Defence Forces, and I want to acknowledge that. And on the other issue, look, of course, we will take note of any legal judgments that are made either in Ireland or in the European Union. And if there are consequences to those judgments, we'll act on them. Of course.